I want to take a few minutes to explain to you why these caves are important. You saw the video, you walked through the museum, you saw some of the importance with regards to the discoveries in these caves. You saw them on the video about John the Baptist. Did anybody here find that information unusual to you? Anybody here ever heard of John the Baptist, even visiting Qumran? All right, some of you have had my classes. Good for you. When I lecture on John the Baptist in the New Testament classes, we talk a little about John's working in the wilderness and the fact that where we were baptizing today is one of the places that it seems likely that John the Baptist baptized people. Perhaps even our Lord Jesus was baptized there. John lived in this wilderness for many years and preached in this wilderness. The likelihood of John encountering the people here at Qumran is pretty good. But what I want to do before I tie in Qumran to the New Testament is I want to tell you a little bit about the people that lived here. During a period of time that's called the Silent Years, often called the Second Temple period, or roughly 400 years between the time of the events of the Old Testament to the beginning of the New Testament period of time, there's a period of time where there were no biblical books written. Not a single Bible passage was written. Malachi in the Christian Bible was the last prophet collected. It's not the last in the Jewish Bible, but the Jewish canon had pretty much been collected by the first century, by the end of the first century at least. The New Testament would, of course, be written during the first century. During that 400-year period between the time when the Old Testament canon pretty much was done and Jesus came along, there's a period of time where the Jews underwent major conflict and problems. Several different forces occupied this area. First, the Persians came in. I'll give you the short history. Cyrus of Persia took over Palestine, Jewish areas, and he decided, Cyrus was a fairly nice individual as far as how he handled his slave peoples, and he decided to let the Jews go home to rebuild their temple. And so he issued an edict. You can find this edict at the end of 2 Chronicles, in fact, where Cyrus, and this is the last verse in the Jewish Old Testament. It's the verse where Cyrus issues the edict to tell the Jews to go home and rebuild their temple for their God. Cyrus then, of course, is a fairly well-known and respected person among the Jews for this act. But Persia doesn't last forever. Babylon comes on the scene, and after Persia comes Greece. Alexander the Great comes on the scene, and Alexander the Great, after his father Philip of Macedon had conquered most of the known world, Alexander finished the conquering of the world and marched into Jerusalem and even asked permission to see the things in the temple. So Alexander was well known. Some of the Jewish leaders at the time thought of Alexander as one of the people prophesied in the book of Daniel and were willing to show him whatever he asked for because he liberated them, so to speak. When Alexander died, his kingdom was split up. Alexander had no children. His kingdom was split up among 4 generals. 2 generals inherited the lands closest to Israel: the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. I'm not going to bore you with the history of these people, but the Ptolemies ruled in Egypt. Cleopatra, we heard about the other day, was a Ptolemy. She was a Ptolemaic ruler. These people were fairly kind as rulers would go towards the Jews, allowing them to follow their own worship and to worship their own God. They tolerated lots of things. To the north, in what would be known as Syria, near kind of Babylon area, the Seleucids had been given that kingdom. The Seleucids craved Israel for a land bridge on the Fertile Crescent between the north and the south to deliver goods. So the Seleucids went to war against the Ptolemies and took Israel from the Egyptian rulers. All right? This is very important. During this time, the Seleucids were not kind at all to the Jews. In fact, if you read the Maccabean books and the Apocrypha, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, especially 1st Maccabees, it tells of the persecution and the destruction wrought by the Seleucids and how they outlawed everything Jewish, even to the point of destroying Torah scrolls, even to the point of killing, if a baby was circumcised, they would kill the baby by crucifying its mother on a tree and killing the baby in front of the mother. So the fact is, these Seleucid rulers were not very kind. And of course, the Jews rose up in rebellion. A certain group of people called the Maccabees led this revolt. Now, the short version of the story is this. The Maccabees were incredible warriors, great guerrilla fighters, and they often defeated the Greeks in battle to the point to where at about 160, 163, 167 BC, they gained independence from the Greeks for the Jews. In gratitude for this independence, the Jews then declared the Maccabeans, who were of the house of Hasmoneah, that was their family name, were to be kings of the Jews. And so the Hasmonean house began ruling. At one point, one of the Hasmoneans decided he wanted to be priest and was given the title high priest. At this point in time, there were Levitical high priests in Israel, in the temple, who rebelled against this illegitimate high priest. These people are the folks we typically call the Essenes. And they were the people who we think inhabited this area. They came into the wilderness to purify themselves for a future revelation of God, when God would come and wipe out all the evil people and establish his kingdom through the sons of light. Now, this community here at Qumran was a communal community. It was, as you saw in the video, a place where you pretty much had to give up all your worldly possessions to join it. But the Essenes were not confined simply to Qumran. As Reuben reminded us, we found a Damascus document in the Cairo Geniza, which shows us that Essenes in their writings had spread even as far as Egypt. So we know that there were Essenes throughout not only Israel, but also through Rome, as Rome became the rulers over Israel throughout the Roman Empire. So let me tie this up for you. This area we're in is where these people we call Essenes probably lived. They were scribes. They were priests. They were serious people about their religion whose intent was to purify themselves to prepare for the final battle when God would come and establish his kingdom and wipe out all those who disobeyed the Torah, disobeyed the law. And they established this based on a man's writings called the Teacher of Righteousness. As far as I know, we have no idea who this particular person was, but we know that he did not like the Hasmoneans being high priests. He came here to establish a community of purified high priests to rule so that when God reestablished the temple, reestablished his reign, there would be a purified priesthood to rule with God, to do God's service. All right? All that said, you need to understand that from roughly about 163 BC, whenever Qumran was established as a camp, to the time of about 68 AD, there were people living here that followed the writings and the teachings of this teacher of righteousness. These people interacted with New Testament personalities. And this is where I want to finish our lecture off by tying this to our New Testament situation. Qumran is important on several levels. First of all, we discovered here multiple manuscripts. Every Bible manuscript of the Old Testament except Esther was discovered here as a copy at Qumran. We have a copy, or at least a fragment, of every Old Testament book. In fact, you can ask Dr. Roden. Textual criticism for the Old Testament got easier and better in some ways, because these manuscripts predated anything we owned by thousands of years, at least 1,500 years. They were 1,500 years older than our oldest Hebrew manuscripts at the time. But it also revolutionized New Testament studies. Through the writings of this man, this teacher of righteousness, and other sectarian writings, we discovered doctrinal issues that show up in the New Testament. Light versus dark. Anybody here remember John 1? Jesus is the light of the world, and darkness, the light entered the world, and darkness could not what? Overcome it is the Greek term. It's likely that John's writing from a perspective that would be very similar, very amenable to a Qumran perspective. Light versus darkness. Light being the ones who follow the proper teachings, and darkness being those who rebel against God. You also have references in the Gospels to teachings that were probably from the Essenes. The word Essene, by the way, does not show up in our New Testament. You can search for it on your word search if you want. You won't find it. It's not in the Old Testament either. The word Essene we get from Josephus, who describes these people and describes their doctrine. In fact, for years, hundreds of years, scholars doubted whether the Essenes even existed, because all we had was the reference to Josephus, until in the 1940s, when a young Bedouin shepherd threw a rock into a cave and heard not the sound of a rock bouncing off a rock wall, but the sound of glass shattering. Being a curious young man, he crawled into the cave and found jars of paper. Grabbed some of the papers and took them home, showed them to his father, who promptly took them to an antiquities dealer who sold them for a few $100s. The father realized he had something here, came back to the cave, and began to bring these papers out. As these papers became public, they were known as Old Testament materials, and the discovery of Qumran began. Scholars rushed here to the scene. You just have to hear this because it's very important to know. Scholars rushed here to the scene with all their modern equipment to try to find more scrolls. They used x-ray machines, they used digging machines, and the Bedouins still find more scrolls than the scholars ever did. Most of the scrolls we found that we've translated came from the Bedouins and not from the scholars. So it just goes to show you modern is not always better than the old ways. But the scrolls were significant. Jesus says at one point, he's talking to the crowds, and he says these words, "You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy." Now I challenge you, go to the Old Testament, do a word search for the words, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. You're going to be surprised because it's not there. But if you do a word search for the Dead Sea Scrolls, you will find that the Essenes indeed taught to love your neighbor, the sons of light, and hate your enemy, the sons of darkness. So who is Jesus combating at this point? Again, the name Essenes does not appear, but it's likely, or it seems likely to me at least, that these were the people of Qumran, who we call Essenes. One more example for the New Testament to show you how important this stuff is. In the book of Colossians, Paul is wrestling with a group of people who are teaching a false doctrine at Colossae. Part of that doctrine is the concept of worship of angels. The Greek here is literally just worship of angels. You can translate it either the angels worship, that is, as angels are worshiping God, or you can translate it as people worshiping angels. For years, scholars debated what Jewish group, what Greek group, what pagan group worshiped angels. And if you look, you'll find that there is few, if any, references to the worship of angels, that is, worshiping angels as actual deities. On the other hand, there is a book in Qumran in which the people are encouraged that live here to enter into an ecstatic state to where they will ascend spiritually into the heavenlies and engage in worship of God with the angel hosts. It's called the angelic liturgy. And it talks about worship of angels, the worship of God by angels, and how the righteous can enter into that worship. It seems possible that Paul's opponents in Colossae are Essenes. So why are these materials important? They inform us of background information. They remind us that Jesus, certainly John the Baptist, who is a relative of Jesus, if we take Luke seriously, we're familiar with these men and their teachings and probably interacted with them at some point. In fact, it's, I think, without a shadow of a doubt, that Paul the Apostle, a Pharisee of the Pharisees, would have known these Essenes. The Pharisees and the Essenes shared a lot in common except one thing. The Essenes looked to high priesthood, the Pharisees not so much. But doctrinally they were very similar. That Paul knew these people, I think, would be very, very likely. So I want to close with this thought. If the Essenes were indeed a driving force doctrinally and theologically for the Jews during a period of self-rule, mind you, about 163 to around 67 BC, how much more of an influence were they during the Christian period when Jesus, John, Paul, and James were around? It seems likely to me that what you see here are things that Jesus and his disciples may well have encountered. What we see and hear from the documents we found at Qumran should inform us on several levels. Doctrinally, the theology of the New Testament was affected by the Jewish theology here. Culturally, the Jewish people were affected by these individuals. And biblically, the Old Testament has become richer to us by the finds of the text here. We have learned how the Jews interpreted the Old Testament by how the Essenes took Old Testament documents and read them for their community. By the way, the Essenes read the Old Testament in much the same way as the Christians did. They saw themselves in every prophecy, in every warning, and every problem. And they saw themselves as God's community to answer those problems. So, Qumran is very important to us as Christians. It's very important not just for the cultural and theological richness, but as a standing, starting foundation ground for our doctrine and for our ideas.